Hi, I'm Thorsten Reinhardt with the training committee, and we're here for MAAWG's Email Fundamentals Authentication. The presenter today will be William Steffens. William brings nearly 20 years of experience leading product and engineering teams in the financial services. During that time, William led product development for one of the first biometric-based payment processing systems. Co-founded a startup, Golden Gateway Financial, which provided reverse mortgage services. While at PayPal, William led the redesign and implementation of all platform services and capabilities, microservices, and a hybrid cloud architecture. As vice president of a product at Valleymail, William defines and leads product development and strategy. When not working, he's doing one of the two things. He's either spending time with his two young boys, Dominic or Gabriel, or he's golfing. Or both. Take it away. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the time and the opportunity to speak to you folks. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about email fundamentals and specifically authentication. I'll just jump right in and talk about email's original sin. I'm not sure who coined the phrase, but I like it. It's growing on me. And it really talks about comparing email to that of snail mail. When email was first being designed, it was really a bunch of college networks that were communicating with each other. They all knew each other. There was inherent trust there. It was almost like a closed network. And the most important thing about the design was making sure that the email got to who it was supposed to. The to address was the most important piece. What they didn't see or think about at the time was how email was going to change the commerce landscape. And today there's billions upon billions of email messages that are sent on a daily basis. The other piece that was not in the forefront of their thinking was really trust and security. As I mentioned, they all knew who they were. It was a close group of colleges. And so trust and security wasn't at the forefront of their thinking. As a result of that, it left us exposed to some pretty significant security threats. If you look at the Verizon breach report, they say that more than 90% of the cyber attacks actually start from a malicious email. That's an astounding number. 90% of attacks originating from email. There's other data that shows that 5 to 20% of emails are suspicious. So of those billions that are being sent on a daily basis, basically a fifth are not good. Another data point is the attacks are increasing. Quarter over quarter, we're seeing growth anywhere between 50 and 80%. Again, that's a pretty astounding number. And the last data point that I'll bring up comes from an FBI report, I believe in 2016, that states that the financial losses associated with BEC attacks, so business email compromise, increased by nearly 2,400%. So those are big numbers, pretty scary numbers, right? So let's talk about BEC a little bit. So there's a variety of different types of BEC attacks. They all have a common goal, right? They want to do one of four things. They want to extract money from you, have you do a wire transfer to get your cash. They want to collect personal information, W-2, social security number. They want to get control of the goods. Or lastly, they want to take over your account, right? Account compromise. There's a number of different ways that these attacks are executed, right? The primary attack vector is referred to as reply to spoofing, or otherwise known as exact domain phishing. And this is where you get an email that looks like it comes from a legitimate domain, but the return path is to the bad actor, right? This accounts for almost, in some cases, 2/3 of the various attacks for BEC. The second largest attack vector is referred to as display name spoofing, commonly known as friendly from, and this is where an email looks like it comes from a trusted source, generally using open email systems, but it's not. It's actually a bad actor, right? So those are the two largest attack vectors, and then there's lookalike domains and partner spoofing. With lookalike domains, in the example here, see the trusted, they replace the S with a 5. I like to use the example of IBM. If you can visualize IBRN, after a long day, you got a mailbox full of mail, you're busy, it's very easy to mistake that and not pay attention. So today we're going to focus on exact domain phishing. The reason we're going to do that is one, it's the largest attack vector. Anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of all attacks are using this technique. Two, the financial losses associated with this are huge and growing. And more importantly, there's a solve. There's an off button. This can easily be fixed. And what fixes it is authentication, right? And some may ask, why do we really need authentication? We've got phishing protection, we've got spam filters, and so on. If you look at this example, Internal Revenue Service may not be a contact, but it looks legitimate. It might be legitimate. The domain, taxes.gov, may be legitimate, may not be legitimate, but who's to know, right? Without some sort of authentication. The body of the email is just text. There's not a malicious URL. There's not an attachment. It's creating a sense of urgency. There's a phone number. None of that's going to trigger an alert for phishing, right? The bottom line is you can't really filter out intent, right? That's where the problem comes into play. Here's another example. Can anybody tell me definitively whether this is legitimate or illegitimate? It's pretty hard to do so. A room full of experts or soon-to-be experts, if we can't definitively say that this is bad, then how do we expect John Doe or Jane Doe to be able to make that decision when the email is in their mailbox? And the fact of the matter is, if the message has made it into the mailbox, we've already lost, right? We want to be able to stop it before it gets into the mailbox. With authentication, we're basically giving users confidence that they're getting the message from who they're supposed to be getting it from. And it leverages the SPF technology, which is standard rather, Sender Policy Framework, the DKIM standard, Domain Keys Identified Message, and DMARC, Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting Conformance. With those, you basically are protected against fraud and liability. You can protect your brand, and you can ensure compliance and control within your ecosystem. So let's take a jump back in history a little bit and look at an example of a mailbox from, say, circa 2000, right? Filled with spam. At that time, spammers and phishers can send email as if they were anybody. There was no control, there was no protection, right? It got bad enough where the state-of-the-art techniques, IP filtering, rate limiting, content filtering, just weren't working, right? And so the world finally took action. And that started with the canned spam legislation in 2003, right? And what that did is it brought the technology community together to look at industry-wide solutions and how they could tackle this problem. And they decided to go after a very specific use case, right? Their thinking was, we're not going to worry about the spammers. Spammers can send spam all day long as they're sending it as themselves, as long as they're not purporting to be anybody else. And so they decided to go after spoof messages. That was the goal, is to prevent the ability for anybody to send a message as somebody else, particularly large organizations. So here's a view of what the authentication timeline looks like. As I mentioned, in 2003, the Sender Policy Framework came into existence. And what that standard does, it allows a domain to whitelist a set of IPs that can then send email on behalf of that domain. In 2007, the DKIM standard came out, and that allowed you to cryptographically sign a message, right? And it took advantage, or it improved some of the shortcomings with SPF. In 2012, the DMARC standard came into play, and that was built on top of SPF and DKIM specifically, with the intent of preventing fraud, right? So that's where we are today. We're also in the process of working on a couple of additional standards that I'll talk about a little bit later, ARC and BIMI. All right, so let's talk about email authentication, kind of the basics at a very high level. So whether you're using SPF, DKIM, or DMARC, they kind of authenticate in a very similar way. They're going to take the domain from one of three places, from either the return path, the visible from, or the DKIM signature. And when the receiver gets the message, takes a domain from one of those three areas, goes out to the global DNS for that domain, and gets some authentication credentials. And then validates that those credentials match the message, that they're legitimate, and therefore it's trusted. Right? If it's not, it fails, and it's untrusted. So that's it at a very high level. Pretty straightforward. But let's double-click and look at SPF and DKIM in a bit more detail. Okay, cool. All right. As I said, Sender Policy Framework allows you to whitelist IPs that can then are authorized to send messages on your behalf. When a message comes into a receiver that authenticates via SPF, the receiver takes the domain from the return path, goes out to the global DNS for that domain, and validates that the IP is on the whitelist. If the IP is on the whitelist, it passes authentication, and it's good. However, if it fails, there's not a check to check anywhere else. It stops at the return path. It doesn't go any further. So, one interesting side note is when the standard first came out, for the first couple of years, the ability to authenticate via SPF was more a signal of the bad actor than a good actor. So the bad actors were the first ones to adopt this standard. They want to make sure that they were able to authenticate, which is pretty interesting. Anyway, it was helpful. It did some good things, but as with anything, there's always going to be some shortcomings. So with SPF, emails can still be spoofed, right? As I said, the receiver is only looking at the return path. It's not looking at the visible from, right? And so it's just that one check. And there's some other issues with SPF. It's a fairly complex standard that is very error-prone. The receivers actually handle the syntax a little bit differently. And because of the complexities, MAAWG actually wrote a 5-page document on the best practices on how to mitigate against the complexities of DMARC. And that's slowed adoption a little bit. Additionally, there's the 10 lookup limit, right? In 2003, when the standard came out, having a limit of 10 probably made a little bit of sense, right? The limit was put in place to prevent DDoS attacks against the receivers. But in 2019, it doesn't make a lot of sense as we've had a proliferation of third-party services sending email on behalf of other companies. Think ADP, Salesforce, Marketo, SendGrid, TriNet, the list goes on and on. There's some companies that have anywhere from 30 to 50 different services that are sending email on their behalf, right? So this is somewhat problematic. And then there's the case of forwarding. SPF is based on IP. When an email gets forwarded, the IP that's used as part of that validation actually comes from the forwarder, not from the original sender. And therefore, it's not going to be on the whitelist, and it's going to fail authentication. DKIM, on the other hand, the receiver basically takes the DKIM signature, the domain there, goes out to the global DNS, uses it as a public key, and then validates that that signature matches, right? And allows it to authenticate. And it is able to handle forwarding a little bit better. Although it's an improvement, there are still some shortcomings with DKIM. It can still be spoofed. In the case of DKIM, the receivers are going to the DKIM signature and doing the validation there. Again, they're not looking at any other data points. The the visible from address, right? The other point is DKIM's pretty complex, right? There's key management, there's key rotation, there's ensuring that you have the right key size, the right key strength. There's managing the private key that needs to be secured. So a little bit of overhead there. And lastly, mailing lists can be broken when DKIM's in place. So that led to the advent of DMARC, right? As I said, DMARC was built on top of SPF and DKIM specifically to prevent fraud, right? The key points of DMARC is the alignment and authentication. And what it does, it aligns the SPF and DKIM with the viewable from address of the SMTP envelope. Reporting, it provides visibility in terms of what's going on within the ecosystem. You can see who's trying to send email on your behalf. You're seeing how those different emails are surviving from an authentication standpoint. Are they passing SPF? Are they passing DKIM? Or are they failing any of those? And then there's conformance. Conformance allows the domain owner to mitigate against failed authentication using certain policies. It takes that responsibility away from the receivers, which the receivers really don't want to have to begin with. They don't want the liability of potentially putting a legitimate email that failed authentication into a spam folder or dropping it altogether. So that's not a responsibility that they want. The benefits of DMARC, it prevents exact domain phishing. It stops that type of fraud, full stop. Right? Provides protection against fraud and liability, allows you to protect your brand, it gives you compliance and control over your ecosystem. The way that it does that is with what's called DMARC alignment, and there's two key pieces to DMARC alignment. The first, the message has to authenticate via SPF or DKIM, right? That's the first step. The second step depending on whether you're using SPF or DKIM as your authentication mechanism, there needs to be alignment between, in the case of SPF, the return path and the visible from address. In the case of DKIM, there has to be alignment with the DKIM signature and the visible from address, right? That's the key piece of alignment. In the case where they don't align, and here's an example, you can see the return path is bad actor, the DKIM signature is fisher.com, and the from address is example.com. That's a misalignment and will therefore fail DMARC. In that case, those emails should not be trusted. The reporting aspect of DMARC, there's really two types of reports that you can get from DMARC. There's aggregate reports and there are failure reports. At the time this was being designed, it was thought that the failure reports were going to be the really driver for success for DMARC. It didn't actually turn out that way. In fact, the presence of failure reports has actually slowed adoption of DMARC in countries like Germany, where GDPR is in place. US receivers aren't actually sending them anymore. There's a couple Chinese ISPs that I believe that do. The reason it's not is the potential presence of PI information, right? Who it's from, the subject, and other pieces. The receivers don't want to have that liability about distributing that. And so those have gone away for the most part. What has proven to be more valuable are the aggregate reports. Right? These are sent daily by the receivers, and it sums up the activity for that day for a given domain, right? Where the messages were coming from, the IP address, whether it passed SPF, DKIM, or DMARC, and it's proven to be very useful in getting visibility into what's happening within your ecosystem. So as I mentioned, conformance, that's in the hand of the domain owners now, and they can apply policy to control their ecosystem. And there's three different options there. The first option is transitory. It's not a state you want to be in for very long, and that's a P equals none. That is a discovery and visibility opportunity, right? Where you can see from the aggregate reports who's sending an email on your behalf, right? Or who's attempting to, right? The path is really to get to enforcement. And enforcement is defined in one of two ways. One, P equals quarantine. An email comes in, it fails authentication, then that message would be delivered to the spam folder. The other policy is P equals reject. That same message that failed authentication, instead of getting delivered to the mailbox, in essence gets dropped, right? So it never makes it to the mailbox. What I like about this illustration are the steps that head up to reaching enforcement. What it says there is step 100. Now, not necessarily 100 steps to get there, but it does give a good illustration that it is a process. It's not a one-time thing. It's work that needs to be done on a fairly regular basis. It's a journey in essence. And we look at it in a way, it's called rinse and repeat, right? The first step in this process is getting DMARC reports, right? Get an understanding of what's happening within your ecosystem, right? Having visibility there. The next step is actually being able to identify and catalog the different services that are sending email on your behalf. This could be a fairly complex and challenging piece of work. We have a customer that had, in one case, 1,800 different MailChimp accounts for different entities that were sending email on their behalf. Right? So the ability to go through and identify the owners of those services, to ensure that all the services are authenticating accurately, is a challenge. And this is something you go over and over and over, and once you get a good hold of what's happening with the ecosystem, then you can make the next jump, which is being able to apply policy. There's a few different ways that you can go about getting to enforcement. You can do it yourself, you can use consulting services, or you can use automation that will make the work a little bit easier for you to do and much more efficient. So that's where we are today with regards to authentication and addressing exact domain spoofing. We're seeing a large push, or growth and adoption of DMARC. The government has issued orders for all the government agencies to be able to get to enforcement. There are third-party companies that are evaluating your vendors and your partners to see what their security posture looks like. Some of the things they look at there is your supplier able to send authenticated emails? If not, that's a red mark, right? It's a flag, right? So we're starting to see a push towards really taking back control of the email ecosystem. And as we do that, you'll get greater protection because more people are actually taking advantage of it. And this plays in line with what the receivers have talked about a few different times at MAAWG. And that's the idea of having no auth, no entry. So if your emails don't authenticate, they don't want to let you in at all. And so as the population grows that's taking advantage of DMARC, that's something that's going to be easier to do. And in doing so, we're bringing trust back into the email ecosystem. Users can trust email that comes into their ecosystem, and it's a better place for all. And once we've done that, we can start building on top of that phenomenon. BIMI, which I mentioned earlier, is a standard that's being worked on now. And you can think of that as like the first application that's built on top of this new level of trust. BIMI represents brand indicators, message indicators. Today, for the most part, any indication on the email is usually going to be negative, right? It's either junk, it's spam, or it's suspicious. With BIMI, it's taking a different tact, right? If the company, the domain is at enforcement, as this email comes into the receiver, they're able to do something a little bit different. This is an example of an email without BIMI. You can see the BA. It doesn't really give you any confidence, just looks like a regular email. With BIMI, what happens, as I said, if you're at enforcement and you have a BIMI record in your DNS, the receiver can go out, validate your enforcement, see that you have a BIMI record, then go up and pick the logo of your choosing and have that displayed in the browser with your email. And in doing so, you're going to get a better experience with your users. It's easier for them to trust that this is a legitimate email if there's a legitimate logo there. So that's BIMI. And the last thing that's being worked on that's addressing the last mile of the email validation, email flow, specifically to mailing lists and forwarders. So 99% of the use cases are covered with DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. The 1% is tied to forwarders and mailing list. ARC, which is Authenticated Receiver Chain, is designed to address that. And what that does, in essence, is it encapsulates the authentication information. And so when that message is received by the receiver, it actually can look at that and see what those results were. And then it can make a determination as to whether it wants to pass that message along or not, right? And in doing so, with ARC in place, as I said, all the email flow is covered, right? And we're able to authenticate everything. And that's a good state. That's where we want to get to. So in closing, DMARC addresses email's original send. With SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, we can stop fraud. We can bring trust back to the email ecosystem. And it's worth pointing out that enforcement is the end state. And that applies to not just the primary domain, but it also applies to all the subdomains, right? If your primary domain is covered, but your subdomains are not, and you're sending email from them, then you're still exposed. And the same thing applies to email domains that don't send email. For example, Game of Thrones or Hulu, right? You wouldn't expect emails from them, but those should be blocked as well, because those can be taken advantage of. So you get compliance, you get security, you protect your brand. It's a win-win. So that concludes most of the talking parts. But I do have a few slides here we can look at and do an evaluation of whether some of this stuff is correct or incorrect. So this is an example of an SPF record. Does this look legitimate to those in the audience? No. Well, this one's good. How about this one? So this one's actually not, because it doesn't have the IPv6. It doesn't specify the 6. And so that's considered a syntactical error. And the receivers will treat that a little bit differently, right? How about this one? No? Any guesses besides my crew? So this one is actually incorrect. If you remember the 10 limit lookup, in this case, if you're sending from G Suite, the chance of you being able to authenticate are pretty slim, because Zora is going to take up 9 of those calls, and you only have 1 call for one of those last 3 services. So that's not going to work very well for you. This one looks like it's going to be legit, but there's really one problem, and that's the plus all. That it basically opens it up to all IPs, right? And that's literally of no value, so there's no protection there. Nor can you check that many. How about this? Does this look right? So actually, this is not, right? So you have a DMARC record, you've got a policy of P equals none, but what's missing is the reporting. So there's no mail to. And so there's no policy being applied to the messages, nor do you have visibility of what's coming into the ecosystem, right? So it's of no use. And how about this one? It's got a DMARC policy, P equals reject, SP equals none. So this looks like it's pretty good, but this is the example of not protecting your subdomains. So the primary domain is at reject, but the SP, which pertains to the subdomains, does not have a policy. So those are all open. So those can be impersonated. And this one looks pretty good. This is another syntactical error. Right? It's missing the mail too. Right? The reports won't get delivered. This one's good. There's no reporting, but they do have a policy of quarantine, right? So for messages that fail authentication, they'll be delivered to spam. So there's some level of protection there. This is an easy one. Is this past DMARC from an alignment standpoint? It actually won't, because the return path is actually, the L is replaced with a 1, whereas the visible from address is truly example. This one. This one will pass, because they do match. And that's it. So, happy to take any questions. So the question was, what were the primary factors that prevent the uptake of DMARC? One, it's tedious. It's hard work in terms of identifying the services, identifying the owner of the services, and then being able to get those services to authenticate properly. There's also the challenge with some implementations of addressing the SPF 10 limit lookup. So those are the two primary factors. So the question is, what type of organizations are implementing DMARC? We're actually seeing action from all the sectors. Insurance is pretty high, healthcare is high, financial services is high, media is high. So it's really been across the board. The success rate across the board is about the same, but there's not a huge difference from a volume standpoint. The question was, how do we think the ARC adoption will help with overall DMARC adoption? It's really hard to say. There are some very conservative companies that really don't want to get in the way of any email. And so the idea that even though it's 1% could potentially fail authentication, it does cause some to be hesitant. But I don't have a strong sense as to the degree that that's holding a lot of people back. A little too early to say.